So I've been playing a lot of Metaphor ReFantazio lately, and it's a game that has a lot of social commentary in it. One of the big questions it asks us as a society is why no major book releases have below a 3 out of 5 rating on Goodreads. So Goodreads is a website I'm sure most of us are familiar with. Most of us use it to track our reading. It's this nifty little website you can use to build out your online library, make lists, make reviews, follow your friends, see what they're reading. But if you're a Goodreads user, you also probably know that it's ass. The UI is just horrendous. It's needlessly complicated. We're going to discuss there's all sorts of issues with the community. And of course, no one can quit it because it is owned by Amazon. They essentially have a monopoly on online book logging. They got us early years ago before we knew any better. Now we're sort of just stuck with it. And I was going to make a video just talking about Goodreads as a whole, but as I was looking into it, I discovered something very interesting about it. Well, it's something I always knew, but I did look more into it, and that is their user review system. Like most sites that track all types of media, Goodreads allows its users to rate and review the books that they read. Similar to Letterboxd and IMDb for movies, stuff like Backlog or Metacritic for games, Album of the Year for music. This stuff is pretty commonplace on the internet. How it usually works is that an individual will be like, okay, I like this movie, I'm going to give it like an 8 out of 10. They go plug in their 8 out of 10, and then it gets added to this, accumulated average of everyone's ratings and presents you with a nice nifty score to represent that product. Now, systems like this have been criticized for a long time, and for pretty obvious reasons. Of course, when you open the floodgates to the general public, anything can really happen. And that often leads to these review averages not always representing the general public due to, practices like review bombing. But we're not going to talk about that today, because if you get away from the review bombing stuff, I find these review averages really interesting. Because you can actually get a pretty good idea of where the general public sits on a lot of things when you look at them. Should you use these scores to prescribe your own personal standard of quality on stuff before you experience it? Absolutely not, you idiot. But just in general, I do think it can be kind of fun to go through a show on IMDb, list of all of its episodes, and you can see which episodes have the highest scores and the lowest scores. And again, instances of review bombing and stuff aside, they do generally correlate to what people's favorite and least favorite episodes are. And as a result, if you go onto Letterboxd, Rotten Tomatoes, IMDb, or whatever, you can see a bunch of movies that people absolutely hate with comically low scores and vice versa. But when you go onto Goodreads, things are actually quite a bit different. So most online rating systems have this scale, out of 5, out of 10, that people can use to, judge the quality of something. Goodreads has a 5-star system, the lowest you can give being 1 star, the highest being 5. But why is it that nothing on Goodreads has below a passing grade? All of these other sites I mentioned, it's very easy to find low-scoring stuff. What's something that was asked semi-recently? The movie Imaginary. And sure enough, it's got bad user scores, indicating to me that most people who watched this movie thought it was ass. As they should. The new Katy Perry album, no one liked that, and the scores, of course, reflect it. Then I think, okay, what's a book it seems like was universally hated and no one ever has anything good to say about it these days? Let's go with Allegiant.
Good.
Okay, let's go Harry Potter and the Cursed Child.
Good.
Let's go 50 Shades of Grey.
Good.
Let's go Twilight.
Great.
So something more recent, To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods.
Nice.
These are all, good scores. Really good, especially if you compare them to, reviews on something like Letterboxd. In fact, if you look up lists of the worst books of all time on Goodreads, it is extremely rare to see something rated below a 3. 3 out of 5 by Goodreads' own metric being fine, being decent. Is it really true that, not a single major book, no matter how much hate it gets, will never get a failing grade? Yes, It's true. Unless you're reading like L. Ron Hubbard or Ivanka Trump or something. It's almost always guaranteed that any book you see at a bookstore will have above a passing grade on Goodreads. No matter how many people you say online collectively say it's awful, you're almost never gonna find it. And I find that super interesting, especially compared to all of these other sites where it is very easy to find low scores. And if you're wondering why it's like this, well, I do have answers for you. And I do want to talk about those and also bring up some issues that it may lead to. So the big thing that makes so many like online review scores unreliable, and the reason people say not to always trust them, there is no objective metric to follow when giving something a rating. So people prescribe their own metrics to them. Standard review scales often have 5 as the average, everything above it being, decent to good, everything below it being bad. But a lot of people put different value behind these numbers, For me, like a 3 stars or a 6 out of 10 is something that's decent. I'd recommend it to some people, mildly enjoyed my time with it, but other people value a 3 stars as much higher than that. They're like, okay, you got the passing grade, well done, good job, good book. And other people think that 3 stars is horrible. What the hell happened to the other 40%? So when you have so many different opposing views of what these scores actually mean, when you put them all together, you can kind of see why the data might not be all that useful. I blame education for this. You go through school your whole life, and if you did well in school, you get a 60% on something. It's usually devastating, and I do think that translates over to how people grade other things. I was definitely able to disconnect myself from that mindset, but a lot of people are still stuck in it, and I don't necessarily blame them for it, because again, this is all subjective stuff. If you think a 6 out of 10 is horrible, that's all we can do. But this thing applies to all of these websites. What specifically is it about Goodreads that is stopping books from getting low scores? Well, the biggest reason, you probably already figured this out, is when you watch a movie, you sit down for like 90 minutes, 2 hours, and that's all the time you have to give to it. If a movie is good, great. If a movie sucks, it sucks, but, it was just 2 hours. It was whatever. When it comes to books, they obviously take much longer to read. So when people go to pick out a book, they are more likely to, pick something that they're pretty confident that they will like. And if someone starts reading a book that they don't like, something that they would potentially give a 2 or 1 star, well, there's a good chance they won't actually finish it, and as a result, not give the book a rating. So this sort of divides Goodreads, unlike these other sites, where the majority of people who are reading and reviewing these books are fans of the genres, fans of the authors, which creates sort of this echo chamber. I'm gonna pick on Words of Radiance. It's a book I absolutely love. It's one of the highest rated books on Goodreads, but let's be real, the reason this score is so high is because the people who are reading it are not only big fantasy fans, but people who were able to power through and love the first book. If you drop Words of Radiance in a community of people who only read romance books, I have a strong feeling that it would not be so high. A recent romance book I read was It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey. This has almost an 80% average, and this is one of the worst books I have ever read. But I also don't generally read these types of books. Like, I think if everyone with similar taste to me read this book, this shit would have like a 10% average, but we just simply aren't doing that. Like, I'm far more likely to watch a romance movie than I am to read a romance book, because the former takes up so little of my time. So while, movies and shows and music and stuff are also still segmented by, its fans are being the ones who are watching and reviewing it the most, there is a lot more overlap and crossover. So when you combine this sort of clique type ecosystem with people who you already think like a 3 stars is horrible, it's easy to see why scores generally run so high. But that begs the question, if like the lowest books are getting is a 3 out of 5, then can't we use that metric to determine how well a book is rated on Goodreads? If something is like scored in the low 3s, shouldn't that be an indicator that people hate it? Well, oftentimes yes. I mean, you will notice that like a lot of these worst books I did mention are generally in the mid to low 3 range. Definitely a bit of a trend, and I know sometimes sometimes when people see a low 3 average on Goodreads, it might raise an eyebrow. But again, that's not necessarily a good metric, because by a lot of people's standards, a 3.5 out of 5 is still a really good score. And some people, especially if you're new to Goodreads, might see a score like that and think, okay, this is probably really good. And you can't really tell because, while there are a lot of universally hated books with scores in the low 3s, there are a lot of classics and critically acclaimed stuff that get scores like this. And when you actually look at the score breakdown, instead of seeing a lot of people hating on it, people are more split or polarized on it. A good example of this, I think, is The Cabin at the End of the World. There's a critically acclaimed book, it got a movie. I really enjoy this book, but it has a relatively pretty low score on Goodreads. And it's generally because people were very polarized on it. Probably not going to make anyone's lists of the worst books of all time, but this is just where it lands on Goodreads' average system. And like I said, you look at a lot of influential classics and you might be kind of surprised to see that they have such low scores. And it's because a lot of general people, might have a hard time getting into older books. Maybe they read the book in school and thus have a more negative opinion of it. Like, it's all these factors that make it just very hard to determine what an actual bad score on Goodreads is. And unfortunately, a lot of people do think that, a bad score is like below maybe, a 3.8, and they avoid other books because of that. But like I said, you can't know if a book has a low score because it's universally hated or just because it's polarizing. Like, a 3.8 still means majority of people gave it above a 3-star rating. How is that bad? Now, there are some trends you can pick apart from this rating system. When something has really high scores, you can usually determine that, yes, the fans of this genre, of this author, really enjoyed the book. Like Fourth Wing, again, absolutely horrible book. I think if people with my taste all read and reviewed it, it would have a horrible score. But the readers of Romantasy love Fourth Wing, and that is mostly reflected in this score. What you can tell by Iron Flame having a slightly lower score is that likely most of the fans who read Fourth Wing and then went on to Iron Flame didn't like the book quite as much. Because, the majority of the people reading Iron Flame were fans of the first book. Sequels are interesting on Goodreads because, it's mostly fans of the original book coming over, so they're more likely to give things a higher score. Again, we go back to Words of Radiance. And, it's kind of insane to me that Arcanum Unbounded has such a high score, but you have to keep in mind that, most of the people who are reading Arcanum Unbounded are big Brandon Sanderson fans already. A fun example, here's Diary of a Wimpy Kid, okay? The first book has below a 4, which is absolutely outrageous, but then if we go to the newest book, it has an absurdly high score, and I've actually read this book. I think it kinda sucks, but again, majority of the people who are rating this on Goodreads are actual Diary of a Wimpy Kid fans who have stuck with it for this long. So of course they are going to give it a higher rating than if this book were just open to the general public. And the data you can collect from that is that fans are still happy with it. So what you're left with here is what I think is probably the most inconsistent review scoring system I've seen on the internet. Just because it has so many factors that contribute to it that it's just so hard to determine what the general consensus of things are. So my advice, obviously throw it out. I think if you look at these scores and use them to determine what you're going to read next, I really think it's a big mistake. If you start a low-rated book and you're not liking it at all, sucks to suck. That's how things are sometimes, but you might find a gem. Now, I could make a whole video talking about the Goodreads Choice Awards and how absolutely insane they are and how popularity based and just how, oh my god, it's a nightmare. And I will. I will do that, but later when the actual Choice Awards for this year start. I think something Goodreads could implement that actually might help people more. I know people have issues with this system, but hear me out, okay? Rotten Tomatoes. What you see on Rotten Tomatoes is not the average of scores given by critics and audiences. It is a percentage of how many people enjoyed the film. And I think if you saw a percentage on Goodreads that was more something like Fourth Wing, 95% of Romantasy fans enjoyed this book, would be a lot more valuable than just seeing it has a similar rating to The Way of Kings and going oh my god, this has the same rating as my favorite book. I'm sure I'll love it. That's just a thought, Jeff Bezos. I mean, you don't have to do anything. Like I said, you have a monopoly on this. You have absolutely no incentive to make your site better. But yeah, those are my thoughts on this whole situation. The only review scores that actually should matter to you are mine. Go to my Goodreads, add me as a friend if you want, but look at my scores. Those are the objective, true ones. I don't make the rules. That's just how it is. Thank you all for watching. Leave your thoughts on anything in the comments down below. Let me know if you have your own wacky personal rating system for stuff. And I will see you all soon for a new video.